The city lights flickered faintly in the distance as Daniel sat on the edge of his narrow dormitory bed, staring at the worn-out textbooks stacked on his desk. He was 22, a poor scholarship student trying to keep up with the endless demands of university. His shoes had holes in them, his wallet was almost always empty, and the idea of a promising future felt more like a fantasy than reality. Every night he thought about quitting, but something deep inside kept him going, the belief that perhaps one day life would reward him for his struggles. Daniel had grown up in poverty, the son of a janitor and a seamstress who both worked tirelessly yet never managed to escape the endless cycle of bills and debt. After his father passed away, Daniel carried the responsibility of supporting his mother and younger sister back in the village. While his classmates spent weekends at parties, Daniel worked part-time jobs, delivering food, cleaning tables, and sometimes tutoring high school kids, just to send a few dollars back home. But no matter how hard he worked, it was never enough. His tuition fees piled up, rent notices threatened eviction, and hunger was a silent companion he had learned to endure. It was in this fragile state of exhaustion and hopelessness that his life took an unexpected turn, one that would later shock not just him, but everyone around him. One late evening, while he was helping at a charity gala as a waiter, Daniel caught the attention of a woman who seemed completely out of place among the glittering crowd of elites. She was 71 years old, elegantly dressed in a deep emerald gown, her silver hair tied neatly, her diamond necklace reflecting the soft glow of the chandeliers. Her name was Margaret Sinclair, a millionaire widow known in the city not only for her wealth but also for her sharp mind and commanding presence. Unlike the others at the event, she did not treat Daniel like an invisible servant. When he nervously poured her a glass of wine and whispered a polite, "Good evening, ma'am," she looked at him with piercing blue eyes and smiled. "You're too polite to be serving drinks," she said softly. "What's your name?" Her voice carried warmth, the kind that immediately lowered Daniel's guard. He stammered as he introduced himself, embarrassed by his cheap uniform and nervous demeanor. But instead of brushing him off, Margaret engaged him in a conversation, asking about his studies, his dreams, and his struggles. It was the first time in a long while someone had shown genuine interest in his story. Over the next hour, Daniel found himself speaking more openly than he ever had. He told her about his family, the burden of poverty, and his desperate attempts to keep himself in school. Margaret listened carefully, nodding, sometimes smiling, sometimes frowning as though she understood every detail of his hardship. When the gala ended, she slipped him her business card and told him, "Come see me sometime. I think I can help you." At first, Daniel thought it was just a polite gesture, something wealthy people said and never meant. But curiosity and desperation pushed him to dial the number a week later. To his surprise, she answered personally, inviting him to her mansion on the outskirts of the city. The mansion was nothing like Daniel had ever seen: tall iron gates, perfectly trimmed gardens, fountains that sparkled under the sun, and a house so vast it looked like something out of a movie. Nervous and overwhelmed, he rang the bell, only to be welcomed by Margaret herself. She wore a simple cardigan and slacks, far from the glamour of the gala, and she greeted him with a warmth that made him feel like he belonged. Over tea and cookies, they talked again. Margaret was a widow of nearly 20 years, her husband a successful businessman who had left her an empire of properties, stocks, and investments. But despite her wealth, she confessed to feeling lonely. Her children lived abroad, busy with their own lives, and most of her friends had either passed away or drifted apart. She told Daniel she admired his determination, his honesty, and the way he carried burdens heavier than his shoulders could bear. Then came the proposal, one that left Daniel speechless. "I know this might sound unusual," Margaret began slowly, her eyes steady on his, "but I want you to marry me." Daniel nearly dropped his teacup. For a moment, he thought he had misheard her. Marry her. She was 71. He was 22. The gap between them was wider than he could comprehend. He laughed nervously, thinking it was a joke, but her face remained serious. "I'm not asking for romance, Daniel," she explained. "I'm asking for companionship, someone to talk to, someone who sees me as more than my money or my age. I want to feel alive again, even if only for a while. And in return, I promise you a future you never dreamed possible." Daniel's mind swirled with confusion. He didn't know whether to feel flattered, shocked, or terrified. Marry a woman old enough to be his grandmother. The thought alone seemed absurd. Yet, when he thought about the struggles he faced every day, the constant hunger, the unpaid rent, and his mother's voice crying over bills back home, the offer tugged at him like a lifeline. For days, he couldn't sleep. He replayed her words over and over again. His conscience battled with his desperation. Friends he confided in laughed at the idea, some calling it disgusting, others telling him to take the chance of a lifetime. In the end, it was the sight of his sister's pale face during a video call, her school fees overdue, that pushed him over the edge. He said yes. The marriage was simple but elegant, held in the garden of Margaret's mansion with only a few close friends and legal witnesses present. Daniel wore a modest suit Margaret had bought for him, and she walked down the aisle with surprising grace, her silver hair glowing in the afternoon sun. As they exchanged vows, Daniel's heart pounded, not with love, but with a mix of fear, hope, and the weight of the unknown. After the ceremony, Margaret held his hand and whispered, "You've given me more happiness today than I've felt in years. I promise you won't regret this." For the first few days, life felt surreal. Daniel moved into the mansion, surrounded by luxury he had never even imagined. He no longer had to worry about food, bills, or sleepless nights wondering if he could survive another semester. He had his own room, his own car, and more money than he had ever seen in his life. Margaret treated him with kindness, introducing him to her staff, teaching him about her business, and even encouraging him to continue his studies without financial worry. And yet, Daniel couldn't shake off a strange unease. Whenever he wandered through the mansion, he noticed locked doors he was forbidden to enter. At night, he sometimes heard faint footsteps in the hallways even though the staff had all gone home. And most unsettling of all was Margaret's study, a room she kept locked at all times, where she spent hours alone, emerging with eyes red as if she had been crying, or hiding something. On the 7th day of their marriage, Daniel stumbled upon something that made his blood run cold, something that would change everything he thought he knew about Margaret Sinclair and the life he had just stepped into. The 7th day of Daniel's marriage began like any other. The morning sun poured through the massive glass windows of the mansion, lighting up the marble floors. Margaret had left early for a meeting with her lawyer, leaving Daniel alone with the house staff. For the first time since moving in, he felt the overwhelming silence of wealth, the kind of quiet that presses against your chest until you can hardly breathe. He tried to distract himself with his textbooks, but his mind wandered back to the locked doors, the faint footsteps he had heard at night, and the forbidden study. Curiosity, mixed with suspicion, gnawed at him. Why would Margaret, who seemed so open about her life, keep entire sections of the house off limits? By noon, when most of the staff went on break, Daniel found himself wandering down the long corridor leading to the east wing, the one place Margaret had strictly told him not to enter. The polished wooden doors looked ordinary, yet they carried a strange heaviness, as though they were guarding secrets buried deep in the house. He stopped in front of the study. The lock gleamed under the light. He hesitated, knowing that breaking Margaret's trust so soon after their marriage could ruin everything. But then, as if fate itself had intervened, he noticed something, a small silver key resting on the console table nearby. He had never seen it before. It was almost as though it had been left for him. His heart raced as he picked it up. Hands trembling, he slid it into the lock, and with a soft click, the door opened. The room was darker than he expected. Heavy curtains blocked out most of the sunlight. The air smelled faintly of old books and something metallic, almost like dried blood. As his eyes adjusted, Daniel saw row after row of shelves filled with leather-bound journals, photo albums, and documents stacked neatly in boxes. On the desk at the center sat a large framed portrait of a man, tall, broad-shouldered, with piercing eyes that seemed to follow him. Daniel guessed this must be Margaret's late husband. But what really made his stomach twist was what he found inside the desk drawers. The first drawer contained envelopes filled with cash, far more than he had ever seen in one place. The second was filled with legal papers, wills, deeds, contracts, many of them stamped with recent dates. And then came the third drawer. Inside lay photographs, dozens of them, all of Margaret with young men, each one far younger than her. Daniel flipped through them, his heart sinking with every picture. They weren't just casual photos, they were wedding pictures. Each man stood beside her in a suit, smiling awkwardly, much like he had just a week ago. He counted at least 6 different young men, none of whom he recognized. Confusion turned to dread when he found old newspaper clippings tucked beneath the photos. Each article told a similar story: young man dies in car crash, promising student drowns accidentally, local teacher dies in tragic fall. And in the corner of every article, almost hidden, was a small photograph of Margaret standing at a funeral, dressed in black, her expression unreadable. Daniel's hands shook as he shoved the papers back. His mind spun with questions. Who were these men? Why had she married them? And why had they all died so soon after? He felt sweat drip down his temple as the pieces started to form a horrifying picture. Could Margaret be hiding something far darker than loneliness? Before he could think further, the sound of footsteps echoed in the hall. He panicked, quickly locking the study door and slipping the key back where he had found it. Moments later, Margaret appeared, holding a basket of fresh flowers. She smiled warmly when she saw him, as though nothing in the world was amiss. "You look pale, Daniel," she said softly, setting the flowers in a vase. "Are you feeling all right?" He forced a smile, his throat dry. "Just tired from studying." She nodded, her eyes lingering on him a moment longer than usual, as if she could sense the storm brewing inside him. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. Every creak of the mansion made him jolt upright, convinced Margaret was watching him. The images of the young men haunted him. Their faces blurred together, but the stories of their deaths repeated in his head. Could it all be coincidence? Or was Margaret someone far more dangerous than she appeared? On the 8th day, Daniel decided to confront her, subtly. Over breakfast, he asked her about her late husband, trying to lead the conversation toward her past. She spoke lovingly of him, describing his brilliance, his business empire, and how she missed him every day. But when Daniel casually asked if she had ever thought of marrying again before him, her fork froze midair. "Why do you ask that?" she said, her tone calm but her eyes sharp. Daniel shrugged, pretending indifference. "Just curious." Margaret smiled faintly, but it didn't reach her eyes. "No one has ever made me feel the way you do, Daniel. That's why I chose you." Her words sent a chill down his spine. He wanted to believe her, but the evidence he had seen told another story. Over the next 2 days, his fear grew. He noticed Margaret watching him more closely, asking him where he went, what he did, even checking his phone when she thought he wasn't looking. The once kind woman now seemed to have an edge of possessiveness, almost obsession. Late one night, as he tiptoed to the kitchen for water, he heard muffled voices coming from the garden. Peering through the curtains, he saw Margaret speaking with a man in a dark suit. She handed him an envelope thick with cash. Though he couldn't hear the words, he caught the phrase, "Take care of it," before the man nodded and walked away. Daniel's heart pounded. Take care of what? Or who? He barely slept until dawn, his mind consumed with terror. By the 10th day of his marriage, he knew one thing for certain: he was in grave danger. Whatever Margaret was hiding, it was bigger than he had ever imagined. And if he didn't uncover the truth soon, he feared he might end up like the men in those photographs, another forgotten obituary in a dusty newspaper. But Daniel didn't know that the biggest shock of all was still waiting for him, something that would shatter everything he thought he knew about Margaret, about himself, and about the strange marriage that had bound them together. The 10th day stretched on like a nightmare. Daniel could barely focus on anything but the fragments of truth he had uncovered, the photographs of the young men, the newspaper clippings, the late-night meeting with the man in the suit. He felt like a prisoner in the mansion, trapped by luxury that now felt like a golden cage. He wanted to run, but where could he go? Margaret had already tied his life to hers legally through marriage. His accounts were linked to hers, his education funded by her name, and his movements monitored by the staff who, he suspected, were more loyal to her than to him. Escaping might be harder than surviving. On the 11th day, Daniel's unease deepened when he discovered his personal belongings had been moved. His worn-out watch, the one thing he had from his late father, was no longer on his bedside table. He searched frantically, only to find it locked inside Margaret's vanity drawer. When he confronted her, she simply smiled and said, "I just didn't want you to lose something so precious." Her words sounded caring, but the way she caressed the watch sent chills down his spine. It was as though she wanted to remind him that even his most personal treasures now belonged to her. That night, sleep finally claimed him, but it brought no peace. He dreamed of shadows moving through the mansion, of young men calling out to him, warning him to run before it was too late. He woke drenched in sweat, gasping for breath. But as his eyes adjusted to the dark, he realized with horror that Margaret was standing in the doorway, silently watching him. "Bad dreams?" she asked gently, stepping closer. Her silhouette against the hallway light made her look both angelic and sinister. Daniel forced a nod, pretending he hadn't noticed how long she had been there. She leaned down, kissed his forehead, and whispered, "Don't worry. I'll always take care of you." By the 12th day, Daniel's paranoia had reached its peak. He began secretly contacting his old college friends, hinting at the strange things he had discovered. But most of them dismissed him, accusing him of being ungrateful. "You hit the jackpot," one of them said over the phone. "Stop looking for problems where there aren't any." Only one friend, Liam, took him seriously. "If you're in danger," Liam said, "get out. Don't wait for proof. Just get out." That advice rang in his ears as he tried to act normal around Margaret. But every interaction only confirmed his suspicions. She was too watchful, too controlling, too eager to know his every move. He felt suffocated. On the 13th day, he decided to sneak back into the study. This time, he searched more thoroughly. Behind the rows of journals, he discovered a hidden compartment. Inside were sealed envelopes labeled with men's names, each name matching one of the faces from the photographs. Inside the envelopes were contracts, prenuptial agreements, life insurance policies, and bank transfers. The chilling part, all of them transferred massive wealth to Margaret upon the man's death. Daniel's blood ran cold. These weren't coincidences. Margaret hadn't just married those young men. She had profited from their deaths. Just as he was about to leave the study, he noticed one last envelope with his own name on it, Daniel Carter. His hands shook as he opened it. Inside was a freshly signed insurance policy worth millions, naming Margaret as the sole beneficiary. The date at the bottom was only a week old, signed on the very day of their wedding. Daniel's knees nearly buckled. His marriage wasn't salvation, it was a trap. He was next. The sound of footsteps in the hall jolted him into action. He stuffed the envelope back, locked the study, and raced to his room, pretending to be asleep just as Margaret peeked in. She lingered for a long moment before closing the door, and Daniel could hear the faint click of a lock from the outside. By the 14th day, Daniel knew he had little time. He had to escape before whatever fate awaited him arrived. But Margaret was always there, at breakfast, at dinner, even during his supposed study hours. Her smile never wavered, but her eyes seemed sharper, as if she was daring him to make a wrong move. That evening, as a storm rattled the windows, Margaret invited him to the wine cellar to celebrate their second week together. The cellar was dimly lit, the air damp and cold. She poured 2 glasses of red wine, her hands steady. But Daniel noticed something off. Her glass was poured from a different bottle than his. His instinct screamed at him. He pretended to sip, letting the wine barely touch his lips, while Margaret drank deeply. She watched him closely, urging him to finish. He forced a smile, setting the glass down, and excused himself, claiming he needed the restroom. As soon as he was out of sight, he sprinted upstairs, grabbed his phone, and called Liam. "Come now," he whispered urgently. "Bring the police. Don't ask questions. Just hurry." Minutes felt like hours as thunder shook the mansion. Margaret's footsteps echoed up the stairs, calling his name sweetly, like a predator luring prey. Daniel locked himself in the guest room, barricading the door with a chair. He could hear her voice outside. "Daniel, don't be afraid. You belong here. You belong to me, just like the others." His heart pounded so loudly he thought it would give him away. The doorknob rattled violently, then stopped. Silence pressed against the walls until the sound of sirens cut through the storm. Blue and red lights flashed outside the mansion. When the police burst in, Margaret stood at the top of the staircase, calm and collected, as though she had been expecting them. She didn't resist as they searched the mansion, uncovering the documents, photographs, and insurance papers Daniel had described. She only smiled faintly, her eyes fixed on Daniel. "You think you've won," she whispered as they handcuffed her. "But you'll never forget me. None of you ever do." The trial that followed made national headlines. Margaret Sinclair, once celebrated as a philanthropist, was exposed as a black widow who had married multiple young men, each dying mysteriously, leaving her millions richer. Authorities reopened old cases, and evidence mounted against her. She was sentenced to life in prison without parole. For Daniel, freedom came with scars. Though he was hailed as the survivor who finally exposed her, the memories of the mansion haunted him. He couldn't shake the image of the photographs, the sound of her voice, or the chilling certainty that if he had hesitated one more day, he would have joined the others in the grave. Years later, even as he rebuilt his life, earned his degree, and moved far from the city, he would sometimes wake at night to the echo of her words, "You belong to me." And in those moments, he wondered if true escape was ever possible from the woman who had almost claimed his soul.